Welcome to Future Back Drinking, the podcast where we take a journey from the now into the next. On this show, I'll be speaking with today's industry leaders to explore the technologies, innovations, and ideas that will redefine our tomorrow. I'm your host, Athina Kanioura. As PepsiCo's Chief Strategy and Transformation Officer, I believe it's incredibly important to have conversations with today's industry pioneers about the technologies, innovations, and ideas that are certain to impact all of us. In this episode, I sat down for a virtual coffee with Dr. Vilas Dhar. Vilas is the president and trustee of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, a $1.5 billion philanthropy focused on harnessing artificial intelligence and data to build a more equitable and sustainable future. With a broad background spanning in AI research, law, and public administration, Vilas is an influential voice in global AI policy, serving on the UN High-Level Advisory Body on Artificial Intelligence, and actively contributes to AI ethics and innovation through roles at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI and MIT Solve. A frequent speaker and media contributor, Vilas continues to shape the discourse on the responsible use of technology for public good. Here is our conversation. Hi, Vilas, and thank you so much for joining me today on Future Back Drinking. We like to kick things off with a quick cheers. Vilas, it's so great to see you. Cheers, a great conversation.
Cheers, Athina.
It is very important to ground kind of our listeners, especially on your current role at the McGovern Foundation, because last year you spoke specifically on a panel at One Young World where you describe your role as being at the crossroads of AI and social change. So explain to us the intersection between philanthropy, AI, and how does that have impact in the world?
Athina, I appreciate you asking the question and for this warm welcome. I love being with you. You know that. Your question, I think, is the question we should all be asking ourselves. And if you don't mind, I'll answer it by telling you a very quick story. I grew up in a really small town in a very rural part of America, and my grandfather lived in a very rural part of India. He had a third-grade education, and he was a figure that has defined so much moral courage in my life. But here's why I tell you about him. When I was a kid, it was my favorite thing to do, to go back to India and to tell him about the most amazing technology I had seen in the year since I'd seen him. I'd bring back cell phones or laptops, sometimes even like a Game Boy, and he loved it. He would ask me a million questions. But eventually, no matter what, inevitably, he would ask me one question. I knew that was the only one he cared about. He would say, "This thing you have shown me, how does it help the people in my village? How does it help the teacher we saw today, the farmer out in the field? How does it actually make people's lives better?" And thanks for letting me tell you about my grandfather, Athina, but that voice has been in my head my entire life. It's amazing to see what we can do with technology and now with AI. But if we don't ask the question, how does it help the lives of the people we care about, we're kind of missing the point.
Awesome. As you are describing, you come from a very humble background. You have achieved so many great things in such a young age. What were those, I would say, incentives that made you be who you are, whether it's the communities, whether it's kind of, your family? How do you see the role of technology influencing who you are now, Vilas, and your accomplishments so far?
Yeah. I've always been excited about technology. I think you can probably hear it in my voice when I talk about it, right? It lets us do things that maybe we never even imagined. I grew up in the era of computers and the internet transforming everything. I think now I look back on that era and all of the cool things that technology let you do inspired me. But then there was always the question. I knew that I was able to use these in my daily life. And then I told you a little bit already about visiting rural India, but visiting all parts of the world and recognizing that all these cool things I was suddenly able to do, most of the world still didn't have access to. So I think those two things really shaped who I am. On one side, a real optimism about the idea that we could definitely build better futures. We could create better access to healthcare and to education, to political participation. I mean, all of the things that you might want. But if we didn't focus on making sure that those technologies worked for everyone, if we didn't make sure that it wasn't just the privileged few, but really technology for humanity, then we were just missing the point. That's kind of guided my whole life. But I'll tell you, everything I've done has really centered around one core idea, that we could take the very best of human technological creativity and apply it to making the world a better place for all of us. And I've done that in the private sector and in academia and now in philanthropy. But it's a pretty simple concept. And it's one that requires us to take a shared responsibility. It's never just going to be our engineers who create this world for us. It's not going to be just our corporate leaders or just our government officials. It takes everybody working together to have one common vision. And I think that's the challenge that sits ahead of us is, can we forge that together?
Vilas, you had a recent interview with Politico, and you talked about how nonprofits and communities are using these tools, right, to impact themselves and, of course, all the people around them. So I'm sure the listeners would like to hear a bit more around that.
Yeah.
What do you see, and what are the biggest risks that you foresee with especially the underserved communities?
I love talking about this because it shows us just how cool the world of technology is becoming. But I want to frame it for you with an observation, right? I think often about the fact that when we talk about how we invest in great technologies, we've made a social decision here in the West, here in the US, to say, let's take our brightest technical minds and let's surround them with resources, with capital and with great board members, with amazing kind of innovation ecosystems, and say, go and build technology for the future. I think that's an incredible virtue. But let me also suggest, Athina, that when we've taken our incredibly heart-led leaders who care about the world, brilliant people who want to address problems like climate change, or making sure that every farmer knows the best time to plant and harvest their crops to ensure they can send their kids to school, or making sure that everybody gets to participate in decisions, those people, we often ask them to build nonprofits, and we ask them to be close to where the problems are, to represent communities. But sometimes we don't do everything we could to get them close to solutions. We don't ask our nonprofits to be technology leaders, and we don't support them with technology resources yet in the way that we should. This is the work that I'm deeply passionate about. I see it all the time. We work with communities to answer local questions. For example, how do they make sure that they understand what's happening because of climate change to the mangroves that protect their village from rising seawaters? How do we make sure that they know what the weather forecast looks like so that they can plan for increased flooding or maybe threats to their crops? And how do we ensure that in those communities that are close to local wildlife, we make sure that we foster better relations between farmers and wildlife so that everybody gets along in a more harmonious way? These are questions that often start from the challenges that communities face, but there's this unique moment in time where we can build technologies to empower and support them, not just to help their communities, but in many ways, for me, to create a feedback loop that actually lets the deployment of these technologies in the most vulnerable places actually create new inputs and learning that helps us innovate better and more effectively.
And Vilas, when you engage with those communities, do you see them embracing this level of support, especially since some of these technologies can be quite daunting for them, and embracing the unknown is not always something that they would want to do. So help us understand how you operationalize some of this support and what is the level of adoption that you see across the board?
One of the things I think is really interesting, Athina, is we're all kind of at the same point in our AI journeys. Whether you're a Fortune 500 company that's figuring out how to use AI across the enterprise, or a nonprofit that's trying to figure out how to use AI to support a vaccine cold chain. And that's actually been an amazing leveling moment. It doesn't feel like one sector is far ahead of everybody else. We're all innovating and learning together. I find the most inspiration when I find a community that steps forward and doesn't start from, I worry about these tools or I'm suspicious of them. Often they say, I know I have a problem. I need to figure out a way to solve it. Is there a technology stack that gets me there? Let's figure that out first. It's actually an amazing lesson that I take out of the world of philanthropy and I apply actually to so many of our shared domains. In business too, I think the question should be the same. It shouldn't be, how do I apply AI in my business? The question should be, what's the problem I'm trying to solve? And maybe technology has a unique way of addressing what I know, what I'll decide, and what I'm going to do because of it.
Awesome. So the society seems to be, as you said, moving towards the same direction. So as you have been engaging with governments and other institutions in this space, how do you see the need of balancing scalability with the responsibility to do good?
Let me say that I rarely see things as a balance, because a balance means you have to take two separate things and put them against each other. So let me say, I think your question is the right one. Here's a few examples of what I'm seeing, and they'll help us get to an answer. The first is, sometimes the starting point for me isn't governments or even large institutions. It's talking to individual change makers who say, I'm going to find a solution. Here's a great example. We work with an organization called Technovation that set a goal of training millions of young women and girls to become data scientists and AI engineers across the world in the next decade. 3 of these girls came together in New Delhi a year ago and said, we know our community is facing these real challenges because of air pollution. What could we do about it? And they built an AI-based predictive model that lets every individual with an app say, here's where I am, here's what the expectation is of air quality in my neighborhood, and here's a set of things that I can do based on what that quality is. Is today a good day to go for a run, or maybe I should stay in? Essentially building empowering tools that let individuals make better choices in their life using AI. I love starting from that story because it gives us a sense that AI implementation isn't just a abstract, massive, here's $100 million that goes into building a system that maybe affects one particular decision. It's something that could affect every single one of our lives. And if that's the case, then balancing responsibility with everything else isn't the right frame. Instead, it should be, how do we build a society where we recognize that we have to make ethical choices about what technologies we build and who they're for? That building tools that only support the privileged few isn't the best way to resource our work. And to recognize that there's a public role to play in what tools we build. And this is my favorite part of the story, Athina. Look, I've been in the private sector and I've built incredible companies and tools, and I love doing that work. But always what I've seen most powerful and interesting is when those tools get picked up by somebody in the community and used in a way that nobody expected. When we build fundamental AI models that have to do with large languages, and you see poets and creatives using them to create new artworks. When we have new tools around supply chain infrastructure, to get a little wonky with you for a second, that companies are using to transform the ways they deliver products to a user. And we say, how would we use that to support a new vaccine cold chain so that we could get vaccines out to people who are in their most vulnerable states right when they need it? What we can do is take the great innovations we have and apply public use cases and build an entirely new framework for how we make decisions about technology. And then we no longer have to wonder about whether they're responsible or not. Instead, we can ask the question, does this promote our shared and thriving view of a common human future?
Oh, this is wonderful, Vilas. As you were going through these examples, I was thinking, could that work in an open ecosystem, a closed ecosystem, a hybrid ecosystem? So help me understand open versus closed and what is the joint responsibility of all the sectors to ensure, to your point, the democratization of those platforms across the value chain?
Absolutely. And I think in 2025 in particular, we're seeing a real watershed moment on this question you asked. I think the early days of AI, and you and I know this well, there have been a few actors that have really pushed the boundaries in pretty incredible ways, but generally have operated in more of a closed model. And we've seen recent changes that have actually shown that open source or open innovation models actually can not just compete, but sometimes can even outperform. So I often think about a piece of news and I ask, well, what does it mean for the decisions that I have to make or that those situated like me do? And I want to share a couple of thoughts that come to mind. The first is, I think that we are looking at a possibility of a flowering of a much more open model, where many, many more people have access not just to the tools, but the underlying infrastructure that lets you build them. And to me, that's an incredibly positive thing. And it means that people who really understand a domain now have the ability and access to actually build the models, the applications, the insights that are needed for them. So as a decision maker, one of the things that I think about is how do I ensure that funding is going to support these models at scale? As of 2025, the Patrick McGovern Foundation has deployed almost $500 million in capital to create AI for good. But when I think about what we're funding, we're moving from funding specific technological innovation to now funding innovation ecosystems. How do we actually create technological capacity at scale across the world? With governments, we're partnering to actually invest in building compute capacity and ensuring that we're doing talent development really across the global south. And maybe one of my favorite things to talk about, Athina, is ensuring that the data we have about the world that we live in is actually representative and useful for us to build those cases at scale. I can give you a few examples on data, and maybe I'll give you one very quickly. As you can tell, I do a lot of humanitarian work through the lens of technology. And one of these things I learned recently that really threw me for a loop. When you ask for data about mineral rights and subsurface deposits of iron ore or cobalt or nickel, It turns out there's a lot of data in the world, as you might imagine. For decades, we've been gathering insights about those really wonky things, geologic features, about river flows, understanding where extractable ore is. As you might imagine, this has a strong commercial focus. Unfortunately, when I ask, where are the complementary data sets that show us where there's surface water that's safe for drinking, the data story begins to fall apart. This is a story that's never had commercial interest, and so we don't know as much as we should about where communities can access safe drinking water. Well, the opportunity is actually for us to tie those two questions together and say, how do we use new approaches to satellite monitoring and geospatial intelligence and citizen mapping to build the most comprehensive data resource set, not just about what's underground, but what's above ground and how communities and people can access them in safe ways. But it's the perfect example of how we tie our new capacities around data, our new AI abilities to predict and model our environment, and tie it to human stories. Let's make sure that we capture the world as it is today so that we can dream of the world it should be tomorrow.
Oh, this is such a wonderful story. And you so rightly mentioned the importance of data in the whole ecosystem. And I want to use this as a trigger to my next question around policy. What is your point of view? Does policy kill innovation or is there a silver linings out there?
Look, Athina, I'm a kid from a small town in the Midwest of America, and to me, the world is actually based in common sense. And so I'm going to share with you two misconceptions that I just hear all the time that just don't fit right for me. The first is this idea that policy is something that kills innovation, or that policy is something that stops tech companies from innovating. And it just doesn't make sense to me. Policy is actually something very different. Policy is about a set of shared and common values about how we see the future and how we align all of our efforts in realizing that future. If regulation and policy are just about limiting tech companies, then our policymakers have missed the point. Policy should be about how we invest public resources in creating better schooling, in creating more and richer data and public resources around compute, in creating an innovation ecosystem where people want to build solutions. This is the first misconception that we have to stop, that innovation and regulation are butting heads. Because if that's all we're doing, then we're wasting time. The second misconception is this idea that policy is something that policymakers and governments create. And look, you and I can tell this just in looking at the world around us, right? Some of the greatest policy that we have, the successes for human welfare, have come because of a combination of civil society protecting those who are most vulnerable, private sector organizations coming forward with positive and useful inputs that actually advance how we solve them, and governments instituting frameworks to deploy public funds and public resources, and laws and regulations that let us actually get there. For AI, the policy conversation has to stop being about AI safety or about what a few companies do. It has to be about how we actually invest in a public AI future. And there's a number of recommendations that I could share about that come from me and from a number of partners, but all of them have a common thread. They're about envisioning what a positive future looks like instead of guarding against a negative one. Because if all we do is say we want to restrict the risks of AI or its tools, well, all we have left is one where AI isn't risky. But we've lost the point of a future where AI enables amazing things, creativity and inspiration, public access, economic opportunity, and maybe most importantly, dignity for every person on the planet.
Oh, this is great. And I'm so aligned with you about the need of having a much more balanced and objective conversation around those topics. So one of the reasons I started this podcast is because I share the perspective that we focus on the immediate risks or rewards of AI without considering its long-term impact on the way we work and live. And therefore, if we were to look 10, 20 years ahead, what steps should we take to ensure AI shapes the future in a way that we actually want to live in, shapes the work in a way that still people will want to work, and also shapes leaders that leverage AI in a way that furthers the societal goals we all have for ourselves and our children and our grandchildren?
I love this question, Athina, and I'll tell you why. My wife, who you've met, her name's Julia, is an amazing behavioral scientist. And so her work and mine have converged in pretty incredible ways. I think a lot about how technology will shape the future. And at one point in one of these early conversations, Julia said to me, wait, you're talking about technology shaping our future. Why don't we spend as much time talking about how we shape technology? That this is a dialogue between what technology enables and what our values should be about what that future looks like. Here's a few intuitions that have come out of that conversation. Too often we talk about the future of work. Let's take that as an example. And people want to talk about, well, will people get displaced or will tasks get displaced? I think we're missing the point. What we're really asking is, let's envision a future where technology and AI in particular take a number of tasks that humans do and say they can do them more efficiently. The question we shouldn't be asking is, what do we do about that for the short term? The question we should be asking is, well, how would we think about inspiration and creativity? How would we invest in making sure that people feel like they have the ownership of designing those futures, of becoming poets and artists, sure, but also becoming scientists and theoreticians that leverage AI to advance what humans are capable of? We could take that same analysis for so many different domains, but what I might say to you to close this out is, if we're thinking about 20 or 30 years, it's very hard to envision that future. It's a human thing. We're good at iterating from where we are today, and sometimes difficult for us to think about transformative visions. But if we can begin to flex that muscle, to ask the question, not how do we go from where we are today to 5 years from now, but how do we create and draft a new social compact of what humanity might look like together? Where would we start? That's the kind of exploration that we can do today that's actually quite fun, because it brings to it not just what we know, but a little bit of what we feel, of what we hope for, of what we aspire to.
So you seem to be very optimistic about the role of AI in shaping the future of work, which is something I absolutely share. Do you feel the same about the relevance of physical AI on how in the future humans will interact with machines, and in this case, robots, AI-driven robots? So do you feel the same about this potential interaction?
Well, I love that you're asking the question, because I think we as a society have been sleeping on this question of robots because we're so looking at AI and everything else that's happening. I think robots are actually going to be the transformative intersection between where what we're doing in AI, which often lives in a purely digital world, intersects with you and me, our brothers and sisters, the people on this planet who generally still inhabit a physical world. And I think we have underexplored how big of a transformation that's going to be. Now, look, Athina, you said I'm hopeful, and I think you're right. I'm always a hopeful person. But I want to be super clear about what I'm hopeful about. I'm never hopeful about technology by itself. I'm inspired by it and excited by it. I'm not hopeful about it because I know what happens when technology is just created for its own sake. We end up building things without always thinking about the consequences, without making sure that we're equipping ourselves to deal with technology. What I am hopeful about, though, is that if we were able to come together and have a conversation together socially about our values and our norms and the rights that we want to uphold, we could bend technology to do incredible and amazing things. Robots are a great example. There's one view of robotics that it might be used to just sustain and develop the system we've always created, right? That might be about extracting things from the earth, that might be about building things far away and maybe cutting humans out. It's not an inevitability. It's not even inertial. It's just happening. But here's the other version of that. What if we made sure that access to the economic benefits of robotics were shared equally? That it wasn't just that jobs would get displaced, but that we might be able to use them to do the things we want to do in our own lives. I saw an amazing example recently in elderly care and ensuring that people who can no longer, unfortunately, travel because of their physical condition can use robots to actually go out and explore natural landscapes, to do things like search for mushrooms in the forest, or to go and see amazing vistas using robotics and avatar presences. And there are many examples like this. So we need to put that layer around robotics, particularly as it begins to transform so much of our daily lives, to ensure that we're building them for the purposes that make sure everybody feels like they're a part of that transformation.
Great. Thank you, Vilas, for clarifying this, because this is a big debate that we see right now, especially with the resurgence of physical AI. So one of my favorite quotes of yours is, we often talk about ethical AI when really we should be discussing how we build an ethical society that deploys those tools. So how can leaders really foster this environment within their organizations or communities? And what is the biggest challenge?
Well, I'm seeing this conversation come to life in amazing ways. I often say, Athena, and this goes back to ancient Greece, but I often talk about AI as a Trojan horse. And what I mean by that is we're able to use a conversation that everybody's excited about, AI in this moment, to actually end up in conversations about much more fundamental things, because you can't really think of AI without talking about participation and power, about equity and who builds. So when we talk about ethical societies, one of the things I've seen is every time we talk about AI, it actually impacts a direct experience between a consumer and a business, between a stakeholder and the entity, between a civil society participant and an actual community member. What does it mean to build responsibility into this? Well, I think one is to ensure that there's alignment of leadership, that in organizations, whether we're talking about AI or any other kind of transformation, people take not just tactical cues, but moral and purpose driven cues from leaders. And so we need to ensure that leaders are equipped to really understand what the impacts of these technologies will be. From CEOs to boards, all the way through the organization, to recognize that this isn't about technology implementation. This is about a transformation of our relationship with our stakeholders. And when we put it in that frame, some things become common sense, right? We don't want to act in ways that violate fundamental trusts, that change the way we think about privacy, that create a new mechanism of interaction that doesn't feel fair and wholesome between anybody. That we want to make sure that the technologies we're building don't propagate inequalities or ills. All of these things are true for the private sector, and they're true for the public sector. We should think about how communities are able to use these tools in ways that promote their interests. To do all of this, we don't need new language. We don't need new mechanisms of thinking about the responsibility of technology. Because again, much of this is common sense. We've spent thousands of years as a society coming up with the rules and behaviors that honor and respect how we engage with each other. We need to make sure that technology doesn't sit in a different silo, that it's not just our engineers who are designing these tools, but that they're engaging with all of us.
Oh, this is truly kind of wonderful, and I definitely see the shift across the community of leaders, but there is more to be done for all of us to be equipped to have kind of this level of discussion. So last year we spoke with Panos from the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI. You work with them closely. So when we look to the future, we do see a world that technologies such as Gen AI and others are becoming a vehicle of more creativity and innovation. But there is an underlying question: can we make humans be more humans? Not just be the vehicle for businesses to do better. So what is your point of view?
Well, you use the word optimism again, one of my favorite words. So here is my view. On one side, I think the possibility of technology is never about what a tool can do. It's about what we can do with the tool. But in order to do that, and here's the reality that optimism has to be paired with, it means that we can't keep going down the same development path that we're on, right? If it turns out that foundation models, these things that we talk about as large languages or other spatial reasoning, are the things that will drive the creation of new AI tools, then we have to make sure that everybody has access to them. And that doesn't just mean kind of the ability to access them, but the skills, the training, the support that lets them say, this is actually for us and by us. If we do that, then I see this incredible flowering of the use of these tools to do the things that we all want to do the most of. And of course, I mean, I love the aesthetic. And so my mind always comes to art, to music, to drama, to telling great stories. But we should also acknowledge that that same creativity applies in building that better mousetrap, in new technological innovation outside the field of AI that happens because of these tools. I mean, we know, I think you and I both know some of the Nobel Prize winners this year who won their prizes because they used AI to fundamentally transform the space of human discovery in their fields. Think about not just 2 or 20 or 200, but every scientist on the planet that has an amazing AI support infrastructure that they can go and totally transform how we think about foundational science.
Okay, now it's time for our lightning round. At the end of each episode, we ask a few quick hitting questions to give our listeners the chance to get to know our guests on a more personal level. Okay, are you ready to begin?
Sure, I'm ready.
Okay, so first one. If you could personally design one AI application to solve a specific problem, what would it be and why?
Oh my gosh. Well, only one. I'll tell you one, which is the thing that I want more than anything else. I think you know the movie Iron Man, right? And having like that AI that supports you and everything. For me, it's a little different. I love learning, as I know you do, right? I want a personalized tutor who sits with me all day long and just teaches me in the interactions that I have with other people, with other ideas, just to be right next to me and doing that. I think we're so close, Athina. I think in the next couple of years, I'll be able to have my AI tutor with me.
Oh, and now, next one. This is tricky for you because you have had so many careers. So if you weren't in your current fields of philanthropy, let's put it this way, what career would you love to try?
Oh, interesting. Well, I have a long list of things, not that I would have done, but that I plan to do in my life. They're fun ones. Like I want to go to culinary school and do a bunch of other stuff. But the one I think most germane today is I would love to become an urban planner. Because I think the places where all of these things intersect, our algorithms, our code, our data, our human interests, where we access food and recreation and parks, and then the poetry of design all come together and how we should design our cities of the future. It's something I've been thinking about a lot recently. I think that would be quite fun.
Well, like I could see you as a chef as well, knowing that you're a food connoisseur. But great. Okay, so are there any books, music, or hobbies that help you maintain perspective or inspire your work?
Oh my gosh, these are great questions. Well, I will tell you I love to travel, not just because of being in cool places, but I actually really love traveling. I love the act of it. I love going to the airport and getting on a plane. As you might imagine, this serves me incredibly well in my current life where I spend about 360 days a year traveling. But I love being on a plane. I love looking out the window and seeing our planet in all of its beauty, and also having the time and space to reflect and just kind of sit for a minute and then be right out in the most bustly, wonderful, colorful, vibrant parts of our planet. So to me, that is the thing that connects some of the work we do that, as we talked about earlier, can feel a little abstract, right? AI and all of the other things to the lives of friends and family members and people all across the planet.
Vilas has traveled everywhere in the world.
I don't count for its own sake, but there are about 50 countries I haven't been to yet, but plenty of adventures to be had both in them and in the ones I've already been to.
Now, what's one piece of advice you'd offer to someone who wants to make a meaningful difference in the world?
Oh, wow. I'll echo some incredible advice from President Barack Obama when he was asked, what advice would you give? And it's the best piece of advice I've ever heard. When you're young in your career, just learn to get stuff done. It doesn't even matter what it is, just that ability to tactically, operationally execute is the most important thing in the world, because whatever your beliefs, whatever your values, when you know how to get stuff done, you can turn intention into action.
Awesome. Now, last one, because it wouldn't be a Future Backdrinking podcast if I didn't ask you this question. Who would you grab a drink with and why?
Oh, wow. Well, I'll say, first of all, I hope you and I get to have a drink together in person soon. That would be great.
Well, again, soon.
Soon. That would be super fun. But, the person who's been on my mind recently is somebody who's a friend. And every time I talk to her is incredible, Jane Goodall. And I'll tell you why I've been thinking about her. Because we spend all of this time using the word intelligence, artificial intelligence, what it will let us do. And Jane has spent her life understanding intelligence, not through our digital future, but through our anthropological past, our natural present. She spends time with the animal that is maybe most like us in all of the ways, and has learned so much about intelligence through that work. I'd be really curious to hear from her how she brings everything she knows in the field to what our future might look like when AI becomes a partner to us.
Fascinating. Vilas, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure as always. This is the first podcast we've done together. We see each other very, very often. Cheers to a great podcast, my friend.
Wonderful. Cheers.
Thank you for joining us on Future Backdrinking. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Be sure to like, subscribe, and stay connected on all your favorite podcast platforms. Thanks again for listening, and we hope to see you next time.